Let's look at a rather special sword which was in the presence of Queen Victoria. Hi folks, Matt Easton here of Scholar Gladiatoria and Easton Antique Arms, and obviously because I deal in antique swords, sometimes some pretty special ones come my way. Now this sword is special by virtue of being a very nice sword, which I'll show you in a minute, but also is most notable for the fact that it was in the presence, indisputably, of Queen Victoria on a number of occasions. The reason we know that is that it is identified as the sword of George Thomas Connolly Napier. Now, he was a very experienced army officer, a general at the time, and he became one of the ADCs, an aide-de-camp to Queen Victoria. So indeed, when he bought this sword in 1863 after his military service is pretty much finished, and this is known as a General Staff Officer's sword. Now, if we look at the hilt there, you can see it has a very particular emblem on the hilt. I'll show you the blade in a minute because that emblem is also on the blade. And that is the crossed baton and sword of the General Staff Officers. So essentially, if you were a field officer, if you were serving in the field, you would usually have the VR cipher in there, but specifically if you were appointed to a staff position, usually something like an ADC to someone very important, in this case Queen Victoria, just about as important as you get in that period, then you'd have this emblem on all parts of your uniform, also on your sword hilt, also on the sword blade as well. So this is known, although it's an infantry officer's sword, essentially this is actually known as a General Staff Officer's sword, because only staff officers carried them with that emblem on. Now, an interesting detail about these is in one of the dress regulations they actually specify that staff officers were to have blades of 34.5 inches long, not the standard 32.5 inches long. That's a little bit curious. The only possible explanation I can think for it is that it's because they were mounted on horseback quite often, so they required a slightly longer blade. That being said, a lot of these that survive do have 32.5 inch blades on, not 34.5 inch blades. But that being said, I've had several through my hands that do have 34.5 inch blades instead of 32.5, and indeed this has a 34.5 inch blade on it. So who was General George Thomas Connolly Napier? Well, I'll read out a description of him and his career, which is fairly concise, which actually comes from an auction of medals which happened back in 1993, but the record still survives, and it's a nice concise description of him and his career. So it says, George Thomas Connolly Napier was the son of General Sir George Thomas Napier, KCB. He commanded the Cape Mounted Riflemen at the Battle of Guanga and throughout the Kaffir War of 1846 to 47, for which services he received the brevet rank of Lieutenant Colonel. He also commanded the regiment throughout the Kaffir War of 1850 to 52, being present at the action at Buma Pass, and commanded the cavalry brigade at the action of the Berea, for which he was nominated a CB, London Gazette, 31st of May 1853. He later served as Assistant Adjutant General of Canada, so there's Canadian interest here as well, and he was aide-de-camp to the Queen Victoria, and was appointed to the colonelcy of the 22nd Cheshire Regiment in May 1872. However, he died in London on the 5th of May 1873, aged 57, not very old at all really. So he had a very interesting and active military life. This sword was purchased from Wilkinson, in fact I'll just show you how we know that. So Wilkinson swords have a serial number on the spine down at the back there, and unlike all other sword making companies, the records for Wilkinson survive. Not 100% intact, but roughly about 80 to 90% intact, I would say, based on my observations, and that is a copy of the record, and this shows us on the record that this numbered sword was purchased in 1863. It's a staff officer's sword. It gives the length of the blade 34.5 inches by 1 inch wide. We'll look at the blade in a second. It also describes the type of blade, and that's also interesting. And down here is G. Napier. Now, the only G. Napier that this can be, who's a staff officer at this time, is indeed George Thomas Connolly Napier. So this is essentially an infantry officer's sword, but with the difference that it's got the emblem of a staff officer on it. It's got a 34.5 inch blade by 1 inch wide, but there is one other thing which is unusual about it. Now, This goes out, I suppose, a special dedication to the people that keep asking me to do videos about Victorian non-regulation swords. And here we have an example. So a standard sword of this type has a fullered blade, and you'll notice this has an unfullered blade. Now, Wilkinson called this particular type of unfullered blade, they call it a flat solid. I'm talking about flat solid blades quite a bit. Funnily enough, by pure coincidence, my patrons will know this because I did a video on Patreon recently about it. A couple of weeks ago, I acquired another flat solid blade that we've got here, and this is a Royal Artillery officer's sword. This is slightly broader. This is 1 1/8 inch wide, service sharpened, nice big fighting sword, 35.5 inch blade, so it's longer and broader, but it's a flat solid blade. Now, we talked about flat solid blades in the past. They're something that I'm particularly keen on. They're one of my favourite types of Victorian officers' swords. The advantage of a flat solid blade is essentially they're better at cutting. You get a more acute edge geometry, easier to make super sharp, less resistance going through a target, through whatever you're hitting or cutting. The disadvantage is they tend to be slightly more flexible than the typical 1845 pattern fullered blade. Although, depending on the sword's proportions and thickness and weight and things like that, that's not always the case. So thickness is really what dictates stiffness. But I have to say that the spines on these flat solid blades, because they don't have fullers, the spines are thinner than a standard fullered blade. So the reason that the fullered blade is stiffer is not that the fuller gives the stiffness to the blade, it's the fact that you've taken mass away in the fuller means that mass gets added at the spine, so they have thicker spines. So a typical 1845 pattern blade has a thicker spine than one of these flat solid blades. That being said, there's advantages and disadvantages with many things in life. I personally prefer these flat solid blades, and you have to remember the flat solid blade, whilst it was a optional extra and an expensive one for a Victorian officer's sword, this was the standard cross-section of blade, for example, a naval cutlass. And indeed, the lead cutters were used for sword feats, which were based on naval cutlasses. So indeed, it was recognised that a flat solid blade could produce a very good cutting blade. And you know, most Indian talwars are flat solid equivalent. There is a cross-section of blade that's similar to the flat solid, but not to be confused with it, that's called a lenticular section. So the flat solid blade is a pure triangle, pure wedge, whereas the lenticular actually then slims a bit towards the spine. It doesn't become an edge at the back, but it's almost like a teardrop with the back cut off. Okay, so it does widen. Its widest point is not at the back like a flat solid is, but it's actually slightly in from the back, and then it gets slightly narrower towards the spine. They're both very similar blades and they're often confused. However, in my observation, the lenticular section blades are more rare than the flat solids. Flat solids are one of the more common non-regulation officers' blades of Victorian Britain. That being said, statistically they're still pretty rare. It's just that of the rare ones, of the non-regulation blades, they are one of the more common of the rare ones. The hilt is completely regulation. You'll notice it is in fantastic condition and it is in a brass scabbard. This is unconfirmed, but I am strongly of the opinion that brass scabbards designate the rank of major or above, what's known as field officer. Okay, field officer rank. So I strongly believe that the brass scabbard accompanies the rank, but also someone who was an ADC to the Queen would generally only be of that rank or above anyway, so anybody who was an ADC to the Queen would probably have a brass scabbard. Brass scabbards, advantages, they don't rust, of course. However, disadvantage, they're softer than steel. 34.5 inch by 1 inch blade, flat solid blade, completely regulation hilt, more or less regulation brass scabbard. You'll notice it's in really nice condition, and you've got to remember this guy became an ADC to the Queen in 1863 and he died in 1873, so this sword was only kind of in service for 10 years. Or was it? The only thing which makes me question that and makes me think it might have been passed on to another member of the family is that looking at the blade, weirdly, it is very clearly service sharpened, and it doesn't seem to be someone in modern times having done that, because it is correctly service sharpened, and also it's only service sharpened from about where the etching ends, which is there upwards, which is very common in period. Why would an ADC to the Queen, wearing this for basically civic duties, require their sword to be sharpened? They wouldn't. So I suspect that this sword was then carried by a serving officer after he died in 1873. I haven't looked into whether he had any sons in the army or anything like that yet, but I will do. But it's all solid and tight and beautifully made. If you don't know, Wilkinsons are secured internally by a nut and externally by another nut, so they tend to stay tight, they tend to stay secure, and they're better made than a lot of other swords of this era. In the hand, it feels dreamy, feels absolutely lovely. Being only 1 inch wide instead of 1 1/8, it's slightly lighter, of course, you know, some people would, I think me personally, I'd prefer the 1 1/8. I'd prefer the slightly wider blade like we saw on the Royal Artillery officer's sword here. But that being said, actually, if you want a more nimble sword, then the 1 inch blade is the way to go. And certainly by this date, by the 1870s, and I've noted particularly in the 1870s, 1 inch wide blades got particularly popular. I don't know why. Maybe because people were more accentuating the thrust at that point, thinking they didn't need as much cutting power. Maybe because there was more prevalence of fencing schools and they wanted something that felt good in their hand, and a slightly narrower blade does feel more nimble in the hand. Anyway, lovely, gorgeous sword. And I will also note as well, because I should have mentioned it before, so that if we look at the blade, let's try and get into focus on there, you can see the etching, you can see the staff officer's crossed baton and sword symbol there, the crown above for Victoria, nice scroll etching all down here, and then if we come down to here you can see his initials there, and above it is the crest for the Napier family, which is a crescent held in a fist. Strong symbol, Scottish family. And on this side we've got Henry Wilkinson, and we've got the by warrant plumes of the Prince of Wales, showing that it's got his sort of royal warrant. I should also mention, of course, that he is a member of the Napier family, and anyone who studies Victorian military history will know the Napier family very, very well. They had many branches and they were all in the army, and they were all doing very significant things. I have one other sword, at least one other sword, maybe two, in my collection related to the Napier family, actually. That one is a presentation sword that was given by Lord Napier of Magdala, in fact, so it wasn't his sword, it was given by him. And I have another sword that actually belonged to his son as well, that he carried on campaign in the Afghanistan War of 1878 to 1881. Anyway, I hope that's been interesting. Here's another one of the non-regulation Victorian officer swords. This will be staying in my collection, I'm afraid, certainly at least for now. Fascinating sword. I'll be doing more research on the family, more research on his military service, also trying to work out why this sword is service sharpened when he was an ADC to Queen Victoria, and quite, you know, a venerable, not old, but certainly a middle-aged officer, and didn't see any active service, as far as I know, after 1863 when this sword was purchased. So why was this sharpened? Did he have a son or a nephew or something that this was passed on to? I don't know. It's another piece in the jigsaw puzzle to find out. Anyway, I hope this has been interesting. See you folks again soon. Check out links below to all of my social media stuff and Eastern Antique Arms website, and I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers folks.